Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 123, James David Pope. James Pope died at the Somme in France only 4 days after his 20th birthday. This is his story. James David Pope, known as Jim, was the son of Francis John Pope and Annie Elizabeth Green, who married at Gunning in New South Wales in 1890. James was born in Bowral in New South Wales in 1896, one of 6 children. His father owned and operated the successful Pope Quarry in Bowral. Francis's grandfather, John Dunn Pope, was born in Ireland, and by the time he was 21, he and his family were living in Scotland, and he was employed as a mason's apprentice. By the time he was 30, he was a granite mason, living in Golspie, Scotland. By 1856, he emigrated to Victoria and married Isabella Stitt in Emerald Hill, Victoria, on the 28th of February 1857. Isabella was Scottish, and she emigrated around the same time. They had 10 children, Francis Pope being the 4th child. On the 23rd of January 1908, it says that Mr. James D. Pope, one of the pioneers of the 8-hour movement, was the first secretary of the Operative Mason Society, and he died at the residence of his son in Market Street, Kensington on Tuesday. He was 88 years and has been in the state for 54 years. James Pope's mother, Annie Green, was born in Gunning in January 1868. She was the oldest of 8 children, born to David Green from Scotland and Elizabeth Wilson. David was a blacksmith in Scotland and immigrated by 1867, where he married Elizabeth at Jerrowa, New South Wales, on the 7th of May, when he was 35 and Elizabeth was 21. Elizabeth had been born in Jerrowa. Her parents immigrated from England in 1842, and Elizabeth was the 4th of 11 children. Annie's father, David Green, died in August 1911, and his obituary reads, "I regret to learn of the passing away at Bowral of a one-time well-known identity of this town in the person of Mr. David Green. He for many years carried on a blacksmithing business here and was a staunch adherent of the Temperance Party, belonging to both the Sons of Temperance and the Good Templar Lodges in Gunning. He was a secretary of the former until its break-up and faithfully carried out similar duties in the Good Templar body until his removal from Gunning." And Annie Green's mother, Elizabeth, died in September 1921, and the obituary reads, "The death occurred on Friday night last at the residence of her son-in-law, Mr. F.J. Pope, of Mrs. Elizabeth Green, who had been an esteemed resident of Bowral for many years. She was the widow of the late David Green, who predeceased her by 10 years. She was in her 76th year, born in the Gunning district, where she resided until 18 years ago, when she and her husband removed to Bowral. In her younger days, she had some exciting experiences with Ben Hall and the Gilbert gangs of bushrangers, and could relate some interesting stories of those thrilling times. After a robust life, she was taken suddenly ill when returning from a trip to Gunning about 6 months ago, and has since then been gradually failing. The immediate cause of death was pneumonia and acute kidney trouble. She leaves 4 daughters and 2 sons to mourn her loss. And on the 28th of September 1934, in the Bowral Southern Mail, it announces the death of Francis John Pope. The late Mr. Pope. The late Mr. Francis John Pope, whose death was recorded in the last issue of the Mail, was born at North Melbourne 70 years ago. He was a son of the late Mr. James Duncan Pope, who was Government Inspector of Stonework in the early days of Victoria. His grandfather also was in the stone trade in Scotland. He came to Bowral 48 years ago and 4 years later married Miss Green, daughter of the late Daniel Green of Gunning, who survives him. 2 sons and 2 daughters survive him, and 1 son, Jim, was killed in the Great War. The sons are Donald and Arthur, both of Bowral, and daughters Mrs. McCoy of Alice Springs and Miss Dorothy Pope of Clovelly, who was in the public service. Mr. Pope retired from business at the quarry some years ago. He was of a retiring disposition, but recently interested in himself in cricket and in work about his home. He was one of the oldest members of the Protestant Alliance. His end was peaceful. He'd been in his accustomed health until Thursday, when he complained of pain around his heart, and a little later he passed away. Deep sympathy is expressed for the bereaved family. And on the 28th of June 1946, in the Southern Mail at Bowral, death of an old resident, Mrs. Annie Elizabeth Pope, whose death was briefly reported in the last issue of the Mail, has resided in Bowral for over 60 years. She was born at Gunning in 1868 and came to Bowral at 15 years of age in the employ of the late Mr. and Mrs. Elkhorn, who then lived at Hawthorne Park. In 1890, she was married at Gunning to Francis John Pope, who worked as a stonemason in the Bowral quarries, and later acquired a quarry of his own, which is now worked by his two sons. A regular attendant at the Methodist Church, Mrs. Pope first attended the Primitive Methodist Church. The lifelong hobby of Mrs. Pope was gardening, and her garden was always visited and admired by many friends. It was typical of her kindly nature and generosity that she gave away most of the flowers she grew. 12 months ago, Mrs. Pope became ill and was taken to hospital in Sydney, where she passed away. Mr. Pope predeceased her 12 years ago, and of a family of 7 children, 4 survive. So Francis and Annie's children, their firstborn was Isabella Elizabeth Pope. She was known as Pat, and she was born in Bowral in 1891. Pat trained as a nurse and midwife in Sydney, and she graduated as a general nurse in 1923 and a midwife in 1924. From 1926 to 1928, she and sister Eileen Small were the first 2 nursing sisters at the Australian Inland Mission in Alice Springs. They had to cope in isolation with all medical emergencies, accidents and epidemics. There were no antibiotics or X-ray machines. When they needed a doctor's advice, they had to travel 3 kilometres by horseback to the Alice Springs telegraphic station, where a message would be sent by Morse code to Adelaide. Isabella married William McCoy, known as Billy, in Katoomba, New South Wales on the 21st of September 1929, when she was 38. Billy was born in Mount Magnet, Western Australia, and his family moved to Adelaide, where he attended St Peter's College. His father was a barrister. Billy served in World War I in Belgium and France in the 7th Field Ambulance, Army Medical Corps 2nd Division. Following his discharge in 1919, he took up a pastoral lease south of Alice Springs in partnership with Jim Smith, but extensive bushfires throughout Central Australia devastated their property and they were left destitute. In about 1923, he was part owner with his brothers in a gold mine, the Hammerjack, at Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory, but this was sold as they could not afford to develop the mine. From about 1925, he was employed by Wallace Fogarty as a driver, travelling throughout the Northern Territory and south to Unadilla. Fogarty had the mail contract for the transcontinental motor rail service from Unadilla to Katherine. Billy and Pat had no children of their own, but they adopted Ron Tilmouth and brought him up as their own son. Ron was born prematurely to Tilly Tilmouth, a part Aboriginal girl of only 13 years of age, on the 21st of June 1937, and he was nursed to health by Pat. His natural father is believed to have been Frank Matthews. Tilly, who was born in the Northern Territory in 1918, was employed at the Half-Caste Institution and in 1942 married Corporal Lewis Miller, and they had 11 children. Tilly died in 1983, and Ronald later stated he was very lucky to have a wonderful father and 2 wonderful mothers. In 1937, Billy was appointed superintendent at the Bungalow, which was a home for Aboriginal children in Alice Springs. During the Second World War, after Darwin was bombed, evacuees started to pour into Alice Springs. Billy and Pat took in these evacuees by train to the Balaclava racecourse in Adelaide, where they stayed with them while Billy tried to find more permanent accommodation for them. William and Isabella lived in Balaclava, South Australia in 1943, where her occupation was listed as a government employee and William as a civil servant. Billy returned to Alice Springs in 1945, where he resided at 12 Lindsay Avenue and worked as an acting patrol officer, later serving as a district welfare officer for many years until his retirement. In 1955, he was appointed a Justice of the Peace. Billy and Pat retired to New South Wales, where Isabella died at Bombo in 1971. Billy returned to Alice Springs following her death. McCoy Park in Alice Springs was named after them. The second child was Arthur Francis Pope, and he was born in Bowral on the 7th of November 1892. He married Adelaide May Godfrey at St Paul's in Sydney on the 23rd of December 1930. Adelaide was a nurse and was working at Bowral at the time of their marriage, and he worked for the family business as a stonemason. They had 2 children, and Arthur died at Bowral in December 1989 at the age of 97. The third child was Elsie Mary Pope, and she was born in Bowral on the 24th of July 1894. She died on the 1st of January 1909, aged only 14. And there was an article that outlined her death. Brave girl drowned. Elsie Pope, 14, the daughter of Mr. F. F. Pope of Bowral, was drowned at the falls near Mittagong on Friday under painful circumstances. Frances Lowe, who was with her mother, was picnicking at the falls and went in for a bathe but got into difficulties. Miss Pope, who could not swim, in going to her assistance got into deep water and sank. Mrs. Lowe's cries attracted the attention of Misters Clune and Groan, who rescued Miss Lowe as she was sinking for the 3rd time. Miss Pope's body was recovered soon after, but her life was extinct. After a time, Miss Lowe recovered sufficiently to be able to walk home. Their 4th child, James David, who was the inspiration for writing this family history story, was born in 1896 in Bowral. He enlisted and was in the 1st Machine Gun Company, and he was a stonemason at the time of his enlistment. He rose to corporal, but he died on the 20th of June 1916 after being killed by shelling and gas attacks at the Somme in France. His mates created a grave for him that doesn't exist today. However, there is photographic evidence that I will add to my Facebook post. The 5th child, Donald Alexander Pope, was born on the 19th of August 1898. He also enlisted in World War I on the 9th of August 1917. His occupation at the time of his enlistment was a horse driver. He fought in Kantara and Port Said, and he returned to Australia on the 13th of March 1919, deemed medically unfit. He married Bessie Forsyth Johnston in Bowral on the 25th of November 1922. They had 6 children. Donald also enlisted in World War II on the 29th of March 1941, and at this time his occupation was listed as a quarry master, and he was 43. Donald was discharged in September 1944, again due to being medically unfit, and Donald died in Mittagong in March 1974 at the age of 75. The 6th child, Dorothy Annie Pope, was born on the 1st of December 1900 in Bowral. She was a teacher, and she married Henry Clark in 1952 in Bondi, New South Wales, when they were both 52, and she died at Burradoo, New South Wales in November 1975 at the age of 74. The 7th child, Hector Duncan Pope, was born on the 3rd of May 1903 in Bowral. He died on the 24th of April 1909, aged only 5, and his cause of death was fracture of vertebrae by accidentally falling into a gutter. And in the New South Wales Robertson Advocate on the 27th of April 1909, it outlines what occurred. Fatal fall at Bowral, a boy's simple death. A simple accident bringing with it fatal results happened on Saturday afternoon to Hector Pope, the son of Mr. and Mrs. F. Pope, well-known and respected residents of Bowral. The little fellow, who was within a week of being 6 years old, asked to be allowed to accompany his sister to town, and he was given permission to do so. His sister had left a short time previously, and he must have gone after her, and in doing so tripped and fell. He was found shortly afterwards lying on the footpath with his head in the gutter, unconscious and apparently lifeless. He was taken to his father's home and then conveyed to Dr. Valek's surgery, but on arrival his life was found to be extinct, while an examination proved that he had sustained a dislocated neck. Widespread sympathy is expressed for the bereaved parents, more especially as it was only on last New Year's Day that they had a daughter drowned at Mittagong. The inquiry was conducted by Mr. Badgery at Bowral. Annie Elizabeth Pope, mother of the deceased, stated that about 3:30 on Saturday afternoon last, her son Hector asked if he could go to town with his sister, who had left home a short time previously. She asked him if he thought he could catch up, and he replied, "Yes, she is only just the other side of the bridge." She let him go, and the deceased started running after his sister. About 2 minutes afterwards, she heard he was lying on the footpath. She ran out and saw a young man carrying him. He brought him into the house, and the boy was quite unconscious. She heard him give some slight gasps and thought that he was dead. She sent for the doctor, but shortly afterwards a gentleman came along in a sulky and conveyed the deceased to Dr. Valek's surgery. James Nish, a schoolboy, stated that on Saturday afternoon last he noticed a boy run out of Mr. Pope's gate. He then turned his head, and when he looked again, he saw the boy lying on the footpath by an alignment post. He went up to him, but the deceased, whom he recognised as Hector Pope, did not speak. Seeing that the boy was hurt, he ran and told Mrs. Pope, who went out at once. On going out again to the gate, he saw Mr. Walker carrying the deceased to the house. When he saw the boy lying on the footpath, he did not think he was breathing. His head was lying near the gutter, but he did not see any blood. Mr. Vallock stated that at 4 p.m. on the Saturday afternoon he received a call to his surgery, and he went at once and saw the body of the deceased lying there. He examined him and found life extinct, but no marks of violence were present. As a result of his examination and after hearing the statements of witnesses, he was of the opinion that death was due to an injury to the upper part of the spinal cord due to a dislocation of the vertebrae. A verdict of accidental death was returned. The funeral took place yesterday afternoon, was very largely attended, including a cortege being a number of school children who walked immediately behind the hearse. The body was laid to rest at the Methodist portion of the General Cemetery at Bowral. So for Paul Francis John Pope and Annie Elizabeth Green, they had a very successful business in Bowral, but unfortunately for them, they did have a number of tragedies with deaths of their children.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.